Hey, it's Chris and Rick Talk Guitars. That's Chris over there in West Seattle. Hi, Chris.
Hello, Rick.
I'm in Shoreline. And he and I were talking, as we always do, whether it's in front of microphones or on the phone. And we were talking about watershed guitars. And the topic of the Super Strat came up. So we thought we'd talk about that because he and I were both playing guitar as young people when that whole fad kind of hit and took off. And I remember it vividly because I was very much into Van Halen, and it affected me to the point where, I created my own little Super Strat from my Mateo copy. I didn't play it much. It was kind of, you know me, I'm whimsical and I'll do something and then I won't play it. But I remember it distinctly, and the effect it had on the guitar world was huge. I mean, it impacted, at that point, everybody then wanted to play a Strat-like guitar with one humbucker or a couple humbuckers and a Floyd Rose and shred. And the market was just flooded with those guitars, Kramer's, Jackson's, you name it, all those crazy guitars. But I remember it vividly. It kind of impacted me, and I was touched by it, and I kind of got bit by the bug, but not too heavily, because the main guitar I played in the 80s was actually more like a Strat, a traditional Strat with 3 single coils. But what's your recollection of that whole thing when you saw it happening and its effect on the guitar world and guitar culture?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, I was in the shit too back then in the day, but I remember it. It didn't influence me in any way as far as like playing the guitar or wanting to play the guitar. It was kind of like something that was interesting to watch from the sidelines, but I probably never even really picked up or held one of those guitars. Maybe in the 90s when, like, if something came through the shop when I was working at it. I guess we should maybe go over, first of all, an outline of what I refer to as a Super Strat is something different. I always just assumed that a Super Strat was a Stratocaster that had a humbucker, a single coil, or sometimes 2 humbuckers. It had like a really flat, wide neck, and it had some fancy schmancy vibrato, like high-tech vibrato system, usually like a Floyd Rose, but sometimes a Kahler or whatever. Is that pretty much? And also, like a little bit later on, like hot colors came in, like, chartreuse and pink. So the colors later on. It's interesting because I was thinking about this the other day when we talked about this, is sometime probably in the very early 80s, I used to go to this little music store in Saginaw, Michigan, and they had Kramer guitars there, and they were actually pretty cool. They were Strat-shaped guitars. They had a Strat headstock, and and they said Kramer on them. And they didn't have, I don't remember them having like a Floyd Rose. I just remember them having a Strat-style bridge. In the Kramer history said that they made about 1,000 guitars with the Fender-shaped headstock, and that was it. There were like 50 of them in this one store in Saginaw, Michigan, so I don't know where the other 950 were. It was a cool guitar. I remember picking it up and saying, oh, this would be cool. And it was like, $300 or something for a new USA, Strat-style guitar. So it was a good deal.
Interesting.
And then shortly after that, that's when the Super Strat really started kicking in, where you started seeing a lot of them. And, towards the middle of the 80s, they got into the really hot colors and shit like that. But it's so funny because that guitar was really polarizing, I think, for a lot of people. I knew people that didn't play guitar or weren't musicians at all that hated those guitars. And when you mention those guitars, because MTV was on and someone's like, oh, I hate that fucking guitar. Like, when they got to the pointy headstock phase, which, a lot of them just like, because it just became so associated with hair metal. I mean, that's like, where it went and kind of where it ended up. At the time I was playing an actual Stratocaster, a USA Stratocaster, and I didn't like them at all. I didn't even give them much thought other than probably negatively. Like if I saw like, oh, that's a metal guitar, I don't want anything to do with that. But how about you? What did you think of them when they started popping up?
Well, it's interesting because my first exposure to it was the Van Halen guitar. I saw that album cover and heard his, guitar sound, and I'm like, oh man, that's insane. And so I had at the time this Mateo Strat that I converted into kind of an Eddie Van Halen guitar. I bought a Seymour Duncan Eddie Van Halen pickup, humbucker, put it in there. I didn't put a Floyd on it. I just left the stock trim, which is like a Fender trim. But it was more kind of a curiosity. I didn't really play the guitar much, actually. It was kind of more like a shop project, kind of inspired by this weird guitar I saw on that album cover. And like you, my main guitar, it wasn't a Strat, but it was a Yamaha that had a Strat configuration, just 3 single coils, and that was it. So again, so it's weird. It didn't really affect me in the way that it affected other people, where it's like, hey, I'm going to get a Super Strat, and that's going to be my main axe, you know. And I could never get my head around. At the time, too, the Floyd Rose thing was really heavy. People were routing out their guitars and having those things put in their guitars. And that was also part of kind of, I think, you know, the fever that caught on once Eddie Van Halen became this thing, right? Everybody wanted this trem system on their guitar that wouldn't go out of tune, and they wanted humbucker, you know, pickups. So for me, yeah. And I don't really remember polarizing comments among people that I was hanging out with or anything, but I know for a fact, like you were saying, once the guitars got pointy headstocks and all this other crap, and there were just literally pointy guitars, I'm like, oh boy, here we go. The thing that I found fascinating was all the Gibsons and Fenders that people were playing before that were kind of collecting dust, right? I mean, you could go to a guitar shop and everybody was buying these Super Strats or pointy guitars, all these. And the other Gibsons and Fenders, it's not like they went out of favor completely, but there was some shade thrown on those guitars. And you know, we talk about this too. I wish I would have bought some of those guitars at that time in the 80s, because you still could get them for a good price. And like I say, they were kind of out of favor because of the Super Strats and all these other crazy guitars that were going on. So that's kind of what I remember about it.
I guess that would be true. I didn't experience that at all. I mean, I lived by Elderly Instruments, which is a big guitar store, and I spent a lot of time in there, but I didn't experience that at all. And I think it's partially because of the size of my city and the fact that the type of music that I was into I mean, everybody played like classic guitars, you know, everybody that I liked, everybody I listened to, and everybody, you know, in bands or local bands that I played with or, you know, played shows with, we were still all really into the classic guitars. But I'm sure, like you said, I mean, that really did affect things. But to me, it's from the Midwest, it seemed almost like a uniform. Like you're in a hair metal band or you're in a metal band, you got to have one of these, and you got to have your solo, and it's got to be a tapping solo, and you got all this. It was really annoying for me. And an interesting thing happened. I remember one evening I went to see this show in East Lansing, Michigan at Rick's American Cafe. There was this band called Rank and File who were playing, and they were like an old, like Austin, like roots cowpunk band. And I went to see them, and they were great. But one of the guitar players had a Super Strat, like with the pointy headstock. And I was just like, I'm like, what the fuck? Like, you traitor? What are you doing? It just seems so odd. I mean, the thing with those are, I guess, they're high performance guitars. You know what I mean? And especially the ones that survived and are out today. Yeah. And I'm just not a high performance guitar person. I mean, even take the Stratocaster, you know, the 54 Stratocaster is like, if you actually play a 50, you know, the original one, especially the Telecaster, it's kind of like, it feels like it was made in somebody's garage, you know what I mean? It's kind of rough. And then just slowly over the years, they just kind of, you know, just refined it. And once it got to the point of like the American Standard in the 80s, I'm like, I don't give a shit. You know, some of the the vintage ones are okay, but it's like, I don't like my guitars that refined, or I don't need them that refined. And I'm such a person who like is into, like, it'd be like a classic car person. I mean, they're just never gonna, you know, some of them just don't really care, even though the cars are so much better and so much more efficient and all that other shit. It's like, they just don't care. And that's me with guitars. So it was interesting. Like, I thought of that just while you were talking about that Rank and File show. And just like, that's it funny. Wasn't just me and a couple people I was with. They're like, you see his guitar? It's like, that's not cool, man. It's like,
sacrilege.
I guess, you know, when you were talking about Super Strat, started talking about Eddie Van Halen's guitar, which I never really thought of as Super Strat. It was something to me when I think about it is after it became into a production guitar, you know what I mean? Yeah. Eddie Van Halen was certainly responsible for that, the one to get all the guitar makers to do it. But people were doing that long before he was. You know, the Fenders in general are really good guitars to do shit like that. Yeah. But it's just so interesting that you get somebody like Eddie Van Halen who comes out with like this revolutionary sound and way of approaching something, and suddenly by 1985 everybody was making one. Even Fender and Gibson were making them. Yeah. So, you know, the Super Strat guitars.
Well, and I think you're right. You're obviously right. I mean, people were modding their guitars before that, but I think, like you said, the watershed moment, though, the planets aligned, and then Eddie Van Halen came along with that, Frankenstrat that he built.
Right.
And I think that is the proto Super Strat guitar, that everything followed. And also, like you're saying, the style of play, like everybody was tapping too. Like that's another interesting thing, that it's not only the guitar itself in terms of the hardware and everything else, but the style of play that was introduced with, as that Super Strat was being introduced, was all, this one style of guitar playing that was spawned by this one guy too. And it's like, and for better or worse, I'll stress the worst. It's like, everybody was tapping and everybody had these Super Strats. And yeah, I just think it's kind of interesting.
It's super interesting, and it is kind of fascinating that, as revolutionary as what Eddie Van Halen did, that it was like a matter of months before it got so annoying.
Totally, dude.
It didn't take very long at all. It's like everybody just went there, and I know he got really pissed off, I'm sure, because just to hear everybody kind of like taking his thing, but it's just like there were no more guitar solos really. It was just like this wank fest, and you would hear him like in a lot of these like hair metal bands. They would have like this, almost like this sappy, like kind of like power pop ballad thing. And there would be this section in the song where it would just pretty much change, and the solo would be stuck in there, and it had to be something that did tapping, and it had to be really fast and really, really technical. And it was just really annoying for me anyways. That time was kind of bleak, but it was a very exciting time for me because I was listening to, music that was new to me. So I was only aware of it on the peripheral, and in guitar magazines. I'd get guitar magazines and I'd go, oh, Jesus Christ. But there were a few people, God, kudos to Slash from Guns N' Roses. He kind of saved the Les Paul during the height of that. He just like,
that's true.
Fuck it. There's no rock in these rock bands anymore. So he tried to put the rock back in the rock band, and it went with the Les Paul, and it worked. And remember Cinderella?
Yeah,
they had the hair metal.
Yes,
but that dude had to put Les Paul custom.
That's right. That's right.
They stuck to their guns. They're like, fuck it. We just want, we want a classic guitar. But yeah.
Now that you say it too, like locally when I was in bands too, a lot of the bands played cool regular instruments like Gibsons and Fenders and stuff like that. But I was seeing this pervasive trend that guitarists that were using those guitars, like, remember the Washburn, truncated Explorer guitars that, we talk about, those cropped up, and those cropped up a lot, and some of the pointy guitars. So but I guess I'm thinking just watching MTV at that time, like you're saying, like every other band had these pointy guitar or a Super Strat, and like you said. I got tired of it too, because it wasn't, to me, when I first heard Eddie Van Halen do it, it was mind blowing because I really haven't heard tapping like that before. And he had kind of integrated it into his style, which was cool. But when it became a thing, it just became, to me, this big parlor trick that everybody tried to squeeze into their solo or their style, which wasn't their style. It's like, you're not doing, you're not playing your style. You're taking this parlor trick and featuring it, like you're saying, like in this ballad. It's like, what are you doing this weird, super fast tapping stuff in this ballad? And so, for me, it grew old real quick. And I just think it ran its course.
Yeah, it's almost like with Hendrix, like his guitar playing often overshadows his songwriting, and he was a great songwriter. And so, and to Eddie Van Halen, I heard something, I saw a video of him, and it was from the era where, Sammy Hagar was in the band, but he was doing Eruption. It must have been, he still looked pretty young, chain smoking, but he did Eruption. But before he went into that, he was playing this thing. And it was like just beautiful. It almost sounded like Bill Frisell or something. He was using his fingers and he was doing this thing. And it was like super melodic and super cool and super vibey. Not many people know that he could do that because he did, I don't have all of their records, but it's like seeing him do that was like, this dude is really capable of a lot. And then he went into the Eruption, and it's like, yeah, sure, I've heard it and it's really cool. So it's kind of exciting because it's Eruption or whatever. Yeah. I would have loved to have heard a lot more of that stuff in his music. You know what I mean? Like, that's because it was super, super. And you could tell he was into it. It was something he was just kind of playing around with on stage before he went into his big solo. And it was super, super cool. But everybody just keyed in on the parlor trick. That's the thing that happens. And it's like, it's a super cool thing, but it's, you got to have something else to go with it.
Exactly.
Fortunately for me, I wasn't even interested in that and which is a good thing because it was really hard. I didn't have to waste my time trying to do that stuff, but it didn't appeal to me at all. I mean, I didn't really love Van Halen until much, much, much later. Now I do, but I got that first record in '79, played it for a while, and then I gave it away. I didn't, I just kind of it blew my mind. At first I'm like, what the hell? And then I was playing guitar by that point too, and I'm like, oh shit, it's over for me. I'm never going to play like that. And the more I listened, the more I said, this doesn't really do anything for me. It didn't then, but it does now. I couldn't really hang with the background vocals were kind of these show tune kind of thing. Yeah. And I love that about the band. I didn't appreciate it. It was ahead of its time for me anyway. So yeah. So I didn't waste any time trying to, do any of that fancy stuff. I didn't worry too much about the speed. So a high performance guitar wasn't something that I really wanted. So I just kind of was on the sidelines, but I'm super aware of it. And I can remember it like it was yesterday. And I have a stack of 70s and 80s guitar player magazines here, and they're all over the place. And you would be hard pressed to mention a guitar builder that didn't have some form of the Super Strat.
And it's interesting that we're talking about this, because that's one of the ththings I was thinking about too, is how much that guitar maybe influenced a lot of players' styles that other guitar, if they'd played other guitars, maybe that wouldn't be the case. Or you know what I mean? Like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? It's like, was the Super Strat what really influenced a lot of these young players' styles, and they wanted to fucking whammy bar and tap and shit? Or did they have a natural inclination to that to begin with? Or, you know what I mean? Because like, I could never incorporate any of that shit into my style. I just couldn't. It just wouldn't. I did. You know what I mean? Like, I couldn't tap or do these big dive bombs with my. I never really had a whammy bar like that. So I'm just curious to know what your thought is in terms of like, how much do you think those guitars influenced? Well, I guess obviously they did influence a lot, but
yeah.
I don't know. I think about that, like
I think it was the whole package. Nurture, I guess. Yeah, I think it was just the whole package. You have this dude who comes along, he's mind boggling. You're a young guitar player and you're playing, and it just like kind of inspires you or just makes you, it just blows your mind. Everybody's mind was blown, and some people like, it must be in them to try to see if they can achieve something like that. For me, it's like, I mean, if I see like, I don't know if you've seen any of those newer Marshalls that have like 2 rows of knobs. I see those. I get anxiety looking at one of those
the 2-channel or the 3-channel, whatever they are.
Whatever. I just look at it and I'm like, no, fuck it. I can't. No, I pass next. And it's the same with those whammy setups. It's like, it's got on the back of the headstock, you got like 6 wrenches and all this. It's like, fuck that. Yeah. It's like, it doesn't, I'm not a high performance player. I don't want to worry. I don't want to have to worry about that stuff. I have enough to worry about without it. And plus, I mean, one of the things, a big deal breaker for me, even if it didn't have the whammy bar, is like, I don't really like thin, flat necks. I mean, and that's what that was something that you shouldn't, when we're talking about this, like looking back, where everybody is now on like neck size, it's super important for them to have big necks now,
Right.
They would and that was like the era of the super, super thin. Ibanez has had a name for it. It was a wizard neck. It was like they had to come up with a special truss rod just so it would support this thin of a neck. So I didn't really dig that, but I also didn't like the flat profiles. Yeah. I mean, but that is something that, it's interesting to watch. Like, you can see it with Fender. They pretty much, the world has spoken. It seems like the market has spoken for the most part. So the standard now is a flatter neck. It's just like what it is. And you can get the old one as a vintage. But for me, it's like, when I remember going to music stores, and the first time I picked up a Stratocaster and put my hand on it, it feels a certain way.
That radius,
arch to that. It does. And you take that away and it's like, I don't know. For me, it's a feel and vibe. It just trumps just about everything, I guess.
Yeah, I agree. And again, talking about the style stuff, like that's exactly what I got from Eddie Van Halen, listening to him play. I saw them live a lot too. And I think in interviews, he said, I didn't have a lot of money, so I didn't have hardly any pedals. And so I was trying to do get all this crazy shit out of the guitar out of necessity, right? Because I wanted to I didn't have money and it's like, what can I do with what I have? Which is cool. And you can kind of tell that. And like you were saying, a lot of his experimentation was really cool. Like one of my favorite things is on Van Halen 2 is that intro to Women in Love. Listen to that. It's that false harmonic or the tapping harmonic thing. It's beautiful. It's really cool intro. and the song's cool. But so for me, that's the thing that I kind of like lament when these fads happen, is like all the players that come after that sound just like that person, or not even as good as that, but you know what I mean? Just a copycat thing. And Stevie Ray Vaughan comes to mind too. There's a cadre of guitar players that came after him that basically just stole all his gear that he used, and it, they get his sound and they're trying to play his licks, and it's like, dude, just try to find your own voice, try to find your own way, because when you flood the market with just that copycat stuff, I don't know. Then it kind of, I think somehow it taints the original stuff to some degree, to me anyway. Or it kind of sours me on it a little bit.
And that's what we should learn, but we never do. Is that
we don't learn.
It wasn't Eddie Van Halen making that guitar, screwing around the guitar, that made him a great, guitar player. It was his guitar playing.
Yes.
He would have done it if he didn't do that. That was part of his character. He didn't need that to do what he did. You know what I mean? It just helped. And it was just part of who he was.
Yeah.
So, he was a unique person who had a unique spin at the guitar. So that's what you got to find, and not, but we're guitar players. We want to buy everything, or just, I don't know.
Oh, and it's cool to get, to, like you said, it's cool to get inspired by these things and these watershed moments. But as I've learned, I mean, you got to try to, all of us learn eventually, you got to have your own voice. I mean, there's a great story from Phil Alvin about, he was a big Bill Brunzi fan, and he tried to sing like him. And Big Bill Brunzi was talking to him and goes, dude, stop singing like me. You're embarrassing me, and you're embarrassing yourself. And he was so bummed out, but then he realized, he's like, fuck, he's right. I got to get my own voice. And he's he became his own thing. And so, yeah, that story just sticks in my mind, and it applies to all these other kind of copycat things that we're talking about. But yeah, the Super Strat, it just took, it kind of came in a flash and just permeated everybody's consciousness. And then, like you were talking about, it did kind of manifest, or maybe we could say it manifested in a couple of companies, but one is Ibanez with those gem guitars. Probably those would be
that's the one that really stuck. And I think you can still buy them. I don't know. I guess I'm not really that Super Strat savvy about modern Super Strats. I don't know if Charvel Jackson is still around, but they did really well. The Kramer stuff was cool around the time when Eddie Van Halen signed up with them, because they were kind of cool. I love the older Kramer company too. They kind of came out of Travis Bean, and then when they just rolled over to the bolt-on necks, the first series, like I said, they were super cool. And I looked for one online and I can't even find them. Maybe I misremembered the bridge. Maybe it was a high performance bridge, but I don't think so. I think it was just a standard, knockoff. Even Peavy had a Super Strat, and it's so funny. With Peavy's hillbilliness, it was kind of like a Super Strat, but just a little bit hillbilly.
Of course.
What was it? It wasn't the Predator. It was called something. I forget what it had. A cool name.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, Gibson had the Victory. I don't know if you've ever seen the Victory guitar, and they had something out like a USA 1 or something like that, or I don't remember. They had a few, and then Fender, of course. Didn't you have some Japanese Fender guitar that was sort of super strappy? It had like the fancy bridge. Didn't you have one, do you say, for a while?
No, I had no, the only Super Strat guitar I had was that Mateo that I converted.
Okay.
And the only other Strat I had was like an 80s Strat that just had the lace sensor, pickups in it, but they were single coil. Yeah, it was
all right. Yeah.
Strat guitar. And I was always intimidated by the Floyd Rose setup, because I played on those. Some people I knew had them and stuff, but I was like, damn, this is a lot of stuff going on. Like you're saying, you gotta screw through the nut area of your neck. You gotta route out your body. And it's like the Starship Enterprise on your.
No, I like that, even having a couple of Strats, I like the idea of the vibrato or the tremolo or whatever the fuck you call it. But I just, it's just not something that I'm set up to kind of deal with. I think the humbucker thing makes a little bit of sense because, since the dawn of the Stratocaster, there's been no shortage of people complaining about the bridge pickup sound on those.
Right.
Which I actually kind of like. If you have a good one, Strats vary a lot, but I like that kind of, that's the sound of like early rock and roll and, surf and all that stuff. It's really, really thin and really, but there's a rattiness to it when you get a little bit of volume and a little bit of drive to it that only the Stratocaster does. It's not, the Telecaster does it differently. So I like that. And I don't know that I've ever even really played an actual Strat with a humbucker in the bridge. I imagine it would probably sound pretty cool, but I don't know. It's kind of like I like a guitar that, I just like guitars that are what they were. I don't know.
Well, yeah, and I'm like you too. I never could incorporate like the whammy or any of that other stuff into my style. I for some reason, you know what I mean? And it's just a direction I went in my playing. It never presented itself as ways to, I just couldn't incorporate it into my playing. So that's another reason I think, probably it never resonated with me is like, what am I going to do with this whammy bar and stuff? Like I use a vibrato bar sometimes, but but basically just to get, that mellow, stuff. But
no, I love that stuff. That's the stuff. The shimmer. That's really, really cool. I like that.
Yeah. But the dive bomb stuff I could never get. I could never do that. So, well, what else about the Super Strat?
I don't know, man. I know that there are people out there that have a great appreciation for them, and I'm glad that there are, especially like now that they're getting to be vintage. I'm hoping, and I think Frank of Thunder Road Guitars, I think he might be into them, which I think is really cool. So they're definitely of the era, and they're kind of cool. Guitars are so personal. There's just certain things that you look for in them and other things that you don't. But I do remember there was a lot of backlash to those guitars, probably from like 85 to like 87, 88, where like, in MTV or anywhere, just like on a magazine cover or something, there would be like some hairband with a Strat, with a pointy headstock, a Super Strat, and someone would be like, "Oh, that guitar, Jesus!" It caused a lot of hate.
They made a statement, man. Yeah, and the colors too. When you said Frankie, the Green Day dude, Billy Joe, he had kind of a Super Strat. Maybe it was a bastardized thing. He had humbuckers in his Strat. It might have been one humbucker, maybe too.
I mean, it was one humbucker. I think he got that at Fat Dog Guitars.
Yeah.
Like, they put together guitars like. But see, I don't really even think that. I guess we're talking about slightly different things because I don't think of that because I thought of that as like it's a classic Stratocaster with a humbucker in the bridge, which and Kurt Cobain did that too. You know what I mean? And I really don't think I can't really think of them as like Super Strat players. You know what I mean? Because it still has the the regular neck. I think the things that it has to be true. And who cares? I mean, it's just an arbitrary term. But when I'm talking about it, I'm kind of thinking of that, like a super flat and wide neck.
Got it.
The high performance whammy bar, which neither of those guys had. And later on, a pointy headstock, and then the crazy colors, the beautiful colors that all the beautiful hair bands used to play.
Now that also you said something too that made me think about when I was younger too, and playing a single coil versus a humbucker. You when you play them side by side, you see the difference in output and everything else. So you're right. I can understand the allure of like, especially young guys that want to shred, feeling like, that single coil is not going to do it for me, man. I got to have two coils cranking.
And even rockers. I mean, Fender still makes Stratocasters, straight up Stratocasters with a a humbucker in the bridge. I mean, a lot of people. Like them, the pickups back in the peak of this Super Strat, they were ridiculously hot though too. I mean, those were just like that was sort of the hot pickup era too. I mean, if you just think about that little window of the 80s, especially like the mid 80s to the 90s, it was just things were so weird then, and now we've had like how many decades since then, and it has never been that weird. Like it's just, I mean, all that stuff, like the colors and. Just like people, just guitar culture. Like I'm listening to you talk about Eddie Van Halen out in his garage, banging out that Strat. People would like lose their shit. He's like, wait a minute, that humbucker is not for the bridge. It's a neck pick. Or it's just wrong. It's not. Right. It's not spaced for a Fender or just all this other stuff that we obsess over, and it really doesn't fucking matter.
Well, what's cool, like you said, it was this weird little chaotic blip in the. But what's cool is coming out of that is grunge and then like alt music where people started to gravitate towards just regular guitars. And what's cool is kind of what started to happen is student guitars became like the thing, right? Like in indie and even alt stuff. People are playing Mustangs and Broncos and Music Masters and all that other crap, or Juniors and stuff like that. So. Yeah.
It's weird. The Fender, I think the 90s were kind of where the Fender budget guitars really came into it. But in the 80s or the 70s, in the 80s, it was especially with like the English punk rockers. It was the Juniors and the Melody
that's
Makers,
true.
but like the Gibson's budgets. But it is funny because I never thought of that before, because it does seem like in the 90s, that's when, you know, the budget Fenders really became popular. And before that, it was the budget Gibsons.
Yeah.
And now it's both.
Yeah. And I think it's cool because I see a lot of young artists playing like even new Fenders, like new Jazzmasters and Jaguars and reissue amps and stuff. And it's kind of cool. It's kind of cool to see that stuff still has an appeal to, and I think it's also they're probably dovetails with their style, right? Like I know some artists that I really dig that are current young artists that play this Fender gear or Gibson stuff, and it's cool to see. For me anyway, you know, for you and I who've seen these trends come and go and stuff, I just love to see people kind of playing these, just a regular guitar, you know, like, and a regular cool amp, like a tube amp, or that's kind of fun, kind of fun. Well, cool. Well, I think we've covered the Super Strat. All right, man. Well, as always, thanks for listening, people. We really appreciate it. Keep listening on Apple and on Spotify, and keep giving us ideas and corresponding with us. We'd love to hear from you. And until next time.
Goodbye.